Okay, right, we'll move on to our next speaker. I'm going to introduce Dr. Felix Fitzroy. Dr. Fitzroy is an emeritus professor of economics at the University of St Andrews. He has taught in both the sustainable development and economics departments. He specialises in climate change economics and economics of happiness, which intrigues me greatly. His work has been featured in the Economist and international press, among others, and he's currently working on the second edition of his book, An Introduction to Climate Change and Economics. So if I can introduce you, please, Dr. Felix Fitzroy. Cheers.
Thank you, Gavin. Just to repeat, I'm going to try and summarize in 15 minutes the content of a textbook with maybe some hierarchies, the second edition of which is due out next year and which we're working on currently. Well, a lot of you will have read in the media that global warming has slowed down, if not stopped, for the last 12 years. That is absolutely not true. Global warming has not slowed down. What has slowed down is land surface warming. At the same time, due to unusual trade winds and currents in the Pacific, deep ocean warming in the Pacific has accelerated to a faster rate than any time in the last 10,000 years. When the Pacific El Nino returns, weather conditions return to normal, this deep ocean heat is going to be released into the atmosphere, and land surface warming will accelerate to make up for lost time, particularly as greenhouse gas emissions have also accelerated over the last decades. Under a complete lack of any concerted climate change policy, which we abbreviate as business as usual. Well, the key to understanding the long-term influence of climate change lies in the under-publicized, relatively little-known, so-called slow feedbacks. There are two of them: the receding Arctic ice and snow cover. The volume of Arctic ice has dwindled rapidly over the past couple of decades. That means that the ocean reflects much less of the sun's incoming energy than the ice cover. So that accelerates global warming. In the long run, perhaps an even bigger problem is the thawing permafrost in Arctic land mass. This permafrost contains about 3 times as much carbon as the atmosphere, and it is thawing, it's releasing methane, which is much more potent as a greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. The problem is that both these processes are very difficult to quantify, and therefore they are omitted from most of the climate change models which are used by everybody, including economists who try and make predictions about the cost of climate change. However, these processes, from all we know, are likely to accelerate under business as usual, and by the end of the century lead to a mean global temperature rise of anything between 4 and 6 degrees Celsius. So what are the consequences of this likely to be? Well, temperature increases typically reduce crop yields. Much of the world is already suffering from water shortages. These problems are getting worse and predicted to get still worse in the already hot and arid areas in the poor regions of the south, and these are going to be worse affected. Under business as usual, agriculture in these most populous regions will be devastated, and in the long run, this could mean billions of people facing starvation. Now, the models used by economists to calculate the cost of climate change completely ignore large-scale loss of life. All they talk about the loss of a few percentage points of a global output, gross global product, which is predicted to rise 2 or 3 times over by the end of the century. So it's not a very big deal. Now, the only way of considering mass starvation, possibly billions of lives lost in the worst catastrophic case, the only way to look at this is as an ethical problem, not an economic problem. So it's an ethical problem for the rich countries, which have contributed most of the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, although China is now the biggest emitter. It is an ethical problem above all for the rich countries to reverse this trend and minimize the risks which will affect, or catastrophic change which will affect above all the poorest people in the world. Well, let's look at the economics of mitigation, which are grossly distorted by most of the public discussion, including discussion by many economists and, of course, the lobbyists of the fossil fuel industry. Again, the key to an economically well-founded mitigation policy is to start with the low-hanging fruit, very obvious. And the low-hanging fruit are really astonishing. Start with the approximately $500 billion a year of subsidies for fossil fuels. Now, that seems like an obvious thing to stop. One thing almost all economists are agreed on is that the carbon tax is the most effective incentive for reducing emissions, and carbon taxes can be combined with reductions in taxes on goods such as labor, help to reduce unemployment. They are very easy to administer in our current tax system. The only thing that's stopping them is the lobbying power of fuel interests. Well, the next lowest hanging fruit is energy saving in buildings, which in the rich countries use about 40% of the energy. Most of them are extremely inefficient. Improving the energy efficiency and the insulation of buildings, of course, reduces emissions, but it also has direct and short-run financial benefits, simply reducing fuel consumption, so a double dividend. In addition, this kind of work is quite labor-intensive. In Britain, we are in a recession where national income has not yet returned to pre-recession levels. We still have very high levels of unemployment. The construction industry is the hardest hit by recession everywhere, and a green fiscal policy, big government investment in making the built sector energy efficient, would have a triple dividend, provide employment, much needed employment, reduce fuel costs and energy costs, and make a major contribution to mitigation in the long run. Instead, our government, most governments in the EU, the American government, insist on austerity, which is, we know this since Keynes, the completely wrong policy in recession. It just prolongs the recession instead of major government investment, which is cheaper than ever before because real interest rates are essentially zero. So all the rich countries' governments are pursuing a totally perverse policy which defies the economics not only of Keynes but of every serious economics textbook. Why do they do this? Because of an ideological commitment to reducing welfare above all and reducing the size of the government for ideological reasons. Well, the other major low-hanging fruit is in the agricultural sector. There's a lot of talk now about adaptation to climate change because we already have nearly 2 degrees of temperature rise over pre-industrial in the pipeline, in other words, unavoidable due to all this heat in the oceans catching up. So, yes, adaptation is essential, and agriculture offers scope for simultaneous mitigation and adaptation. And that means switching from the current system of unsustainable industrial agriculture, factory farming, part of it, to sustainable or conservation agriculture, which is shown to be much more resilient and have higher yields under extreme weather conditions, improves human and agricultural health, and while industrial agriculture is a major carbon emission source, conservation agriculture, by building up organic matter in the soil, converts agriculture into a carbon sink. In other words, the build-up of organic matter sequesters carbon in the soil, takes it out of the atmosphere, and so makes an additional major contribution both to sustainability and reducing the greenhouse gas emissions. Well, finally, renewable energy. This is the component of mitigation policy which is perhaps most talked about. And of course, it is also essential to complement all these low-hanging fruit I've been talking about. Oh, and I forgot to mention, part of agriculture, of course, is forestation. Reforestation, planting trees, so-called agroforestry, which again makes agriculture more resilient to extremes, absorbs carbon, and stopping deforestation, which is continuing more or less unabated in much of the tropical rainforests. But in addition to all that, of course, we need to convert from fossil fuel energy to renewable energy. Well, coal is overtaking oil and gas in much of the world as the major source of fossil fuel energy. In China, it is already coal is used for about 70% of the energy. China, as I said, is the biggest emitter in the world. They use nearly half the world's total coal production. Coal is also the dirtiest fuel, not only in terms of carbon dioxide, but also in terms of local pollution. And local pollution, air pollution from coal, from burning biomass, is now responsible for about 7 million premature deaths a year, much of it in South and East Asia. And the short-term health costs of burning coal include reducing the average life expectancy in northern China by about 5 years. Similar effects wherever urban populations are exposed to coal pollution. When you include these health costs, all the main existing renewable energy technologies are cheaper than coal burning. Now, the most developed wind power is in purely financial terms, and even excluding the health costs of coal, actually cheaper than building new coal-fired power stations if the wind is in good locations, like much of Scotland, only they're blocked by popular protests. And of course, wind power in Scotland needs grid connections to the south where the power is most needed. Solar energy is approaching so-called grid parity, not in Northern Europe or in St Andrews, where you see lots of roofs with solar panels on them, but in sunny areas like the Mediterranean, most of the south. The price of photovoltaic solar panels has dropped by 75% in the past 5 years and is continuing to drop. So there's an enormous technical progress behind these forms of renewable energy. And according to a number of scenarios by reputable scientists, the United Nations and so on, somewhere between 1 and 2% of global output, global GDP, would be needed for investment in these renewable energies, starting with existing technologies, which of course are improving all the time, in order to attain a zero carbon, essentially zero carbon economy in 2 or 3 decades. Now, such a program is not only technically feasible, it is necessary to avoid the risks of climate catastrophe, driven not only by the current emissions, but by these slow feedbacks, the Arctic albedo and the thawing permafrost. Now, just to give you an idea of the orders of magnitudes, this investment in renewable energy and energy saving is roughly equivalent to current US military expenditure plus global subsidies for fossil fuels. Now, nobody can argue that 1 or 2%, of course, the rich countries will have to bear a much bigger share, simply because they're richer and because they're responsible for most of the existing emissions. The big problem is getting international agreement. So far, there has been no progress whatsoever in attaining meaningful international agreement. Existing EU and UK targets for an 80% reduction by 2050 over 1990 emissions levels. These targets are grossly inadequate, and there are very few policies in place even to achieve these inadequate targets. Current nuclear power is one of the most expensive, if not the most expensive, low carbon energy. That does not mean that there is no potential for future new generations of nuclear power, plus, of course, geothermal energy. There is a huge potential, tidal energy in many coastal areas, including Scotland. But the projections for a zero carbon global economy in 2 or 3 decades, they do not assume any non-proven technology. In other words, wind, water, hydropower, of course, simply extending the existing technologies would be sufficient if the world could get its act together and commit to investing 1 or 2% of global product. As the Nobel economist Paul Krugman has summarized in his New York Times blog, the science is solid, the economics are looking better now than they ever have looked, thanks to dramatic technical progress. The only thing that's standing, so there are good reasons to be optimistic. The only problem is ignorance, prejudice, and vested interests overweight. Thank you.